When the people of God lift up prayer and praise in unity, heaven responds, and every chain that binds begins to rattle and break. There is something powerful about the sound of unified faith. It is not just noise, it is a supernatural vibration that moves heaven and shakes earth. When hearts align and voices rise together in one accord, something happens in the spirit realm. Chains that were once invisible start trembling, walls that seemed unmovable begin to weaken, and the glory of God starts to descend like a mighty rushing wind. The atmosphere shifts because unity in prayer and praise carries the fragrance of heaven. It draws divine attention. God inhabits the praises of His people, and when He inhabits, nothing that binds can remain. When believers understand that prayer and praise are not just spiritual exercises but weapons of warfare, they stop being silent victims and start becoming victorious worshipers. In those moments when it feels like the night is long and the walls are closing in, that is the moment to lift your voice, because prayer invites heaven's authority and praise releases heaven's power. Together, they create an earthquake of deliverance. You cannot remain in bondage when true prayer rises from your heart and genuine praise fills your mouth. The power of unity magnifies the move of God. One person can chase 1,000, but two can put 10,000 to flight. When a congregation, a family, or even two people agree in faith, the spiritual chains that held them captive begin to shake under the weight of divine presence. There is no chain too heavy, no situation too hopeless, no prison too deep when prayer and praise come together in the spirit of unity. Think of the prison cell where Paul and Silas were bound. Their hands and feet were chained, but their hearts were free. The world would have expected silence, despair, or complaint, but instead they chose prayer and praise. They lifted their voices in the midnight hour, and heaven could not resist that sound. It was not the song that broke the chains. It was the presence of God that came with it. When heaven entered that place, every lock was shattered, every door was opened, and every prisoner heard the sound of freedom. That is what happens when people of faith understand that praise is not dependent on feelings or circumstances. It is a declaration of victory in the face of defeat. It is faith speaking louder than fear, and hope standing taller than despair. Prayer brings you into communion with the heart of God, but praise brings the manifestation of His glory into your situation. Prayer touches heaven, praise brings heaven down to earth. When both are combined, it creates a spiritual explosion that breaks chains in every direction. It shakes the foundation of what once held you captive. When your mouth opens in prayer, the heavens open. When your mouth opens in praise, the glory descends. You don't need to see results before you praise. You praise because you know that the presence of God is faithful to show up wherever faith-filled voices are raised. The devil trembles not at your problems but at your praise, because he knows that where there is true worship, his grip cannot remain. There is a power in praying together because corporate prayer builds spiritual momentum. One person's faith stirs another's, and soon a divine current begins to flow through the room. The atmosphere becomes charged with expectancy, and where there is expectation, there is manifestation. Praise amplifies that atmosphere. It's like striking a match in the dark. One spark can set a whole forest ablaze. When the people of God begin to praise in unity, it releases a spiritual fire that consumes every trace of bondage. The chains don't just fall off, they are burned away in the presence of glory. Every chain of fear, doubt, sickness, and oppression begins to lose its power because glory always displaces darkness. When believers pray and praise together, it is as though heaven leans in closer. The angels respond to that sound. The glory cloud begins to form, and suddenly miracles start to happen. The sick begin to recover, the oppressed feel release, and joy starts flooding hearts again. This is not emotional excitement. It is divine reality. God moves in the midst of His people when they agree in faith. The Spirit of God fills the space where unity, prayer, and praise meet. It's the kind of atmosphere where burdens lift without explanation, where tears turn into laughter, where heaviness turns into joy. When you reach that place, the natural laws give way to the supernatural presence. Every time you pray in faith, you're building an altar. Every time you praise, you're lighting a fire on that altar. The fire of God always falls on sacrifice. When your praise becomes sacrificial, when it comes from a place of pain or confusion, it becomes even more powerful. It becomes pure worship, the kind that shakes chains and invites the glory. God doesn't need perfect voices or eloquent prayers. He responds to sincere hearts and faith-filled words. You can be in the darkest prison and still release light through your praise. You can be facing your greatest trial and still shift the atmosphere with your prayer. The chains you feel around you may look strong, but they cannot withstand the presence of the Almighty. As believers lift their voices together, the sound becomes like thunder in the spirit realm. It shakes strongholds, it breaks barriers, it confuses the enemy. The sound of praise is a declaration that victory already belongs to God's people. When the heavens hear that sound, the response is immediate. The same power that raised Jesus from the dead begins to operate in that place. Dead dreams come alive. Lost hope is restored. The house fills with glory, not because of anything man has done, but because of the faith that rises through prayer and praise. It is not about volume. It's about unity. It's about hearts that beat together for the same purpose, to glorify the one who alone can break every chain and fill every house with His presence. Prayer is not a ritual. It's a divine connection that invites the presence of God to invade impossible situations. Too many treat prayer as a habit or a religious act, but true prayer is life, breath, and power. It is the spiritual lifeline between heaven and earth, between the Creator and His creation. It is not about eloquent words or long speeches. It is about connection. When a believer bows in sincerity and speaks from the heart, heaven opens its ears. Prayer is not about informing God of your problems. It is about aligning your heart with His promises. It is about releasing faith into the atmosphere, knowing that what you say in His name carries the weight of His authority. Prayer is where impossibilities dissolve. It is where the supernatural meets the natural. The one who prays with faith does not beg. They decree and declare according to divine truth. They understand that prayer is not about convincing God to act. It is about positioning oneself to receive what He has already provided. When you pray, you are inviting the presence of God to step into your circumstance. The moment His presence enters, everything begins to shift. Sickness loses its grip, fear starts to crumble, and confusion gives way to clarity. In prayer, you're not fighting for victory. You are enforcing victory that already belongs to you. Prayer is not passive. It is active spiritual engagement with the power of heaven. When you come before God in prayer, it is not about reciting words. It is about communion. It's a meeting between your spirit and His Spirit. It's where divine strength is exchanged for human weakness, where peace replaces worry and faith replaces doubt. True prayer changes the atmosphere within you before it changes the world around you. When you pray in faith, you begin to see things differently. You begin to see not with natural eyes, but with spiritual eyes. What once seemed impossible now looks possible because your perspective has been lifted from earth to heaven. You start speaking what heaven says, not what circumstances dictate. That is when prayer becomes powerful. When it's filled with faith, not fear, with confidence, not complaint. Prayer is not limited by time, distance, or circumstance. It reaches where you cannot go. You may not be able to fix a situation with your hands, but you can touch it with your prayers. Prayer travels faster than any message and penetrates deeper than any force. When you speak the Word of God in prayer, it releases power into situations that have resisted every other effort. There are moments when prayer feels like silence, but even in that silence, God is working. The unseen hand of heaven begins to move pieces into place. Doors that seemed locked begin to unlock quietly. Hearts that were hardened start to soften. You might not see it yet, but every prayer spoken in faith is a seed planted in the spirit realm. And in due time, that seed bears fruit. Prayer is the key that unlocks the supernatural. It has the power to turn chaos into order and despair into hope. When you pray according to the Word, you are not hoping that something might happen. You are standing on the truth that something must happen. The Word of God is the foundation of prayer. Every time you pray His Word, you remind the atmosphere of divine authority. You are not asking for permission to be blessed. You are enforcing covenant rights that were already purchased for you. The authority of the believer is activated through prayer. Every time you speak His promises over your life, your faith strengthens, your spirit rises, and the enemy's grip weakens. Prayer builds spiritual endurance. It conditions your heart to believe before you see, and to stand even when everything seems to fall apart. Prayer is the posture of humility that invites divine intervention. It acknowledges that without God you can do nothing, but with Him all things are possible. The presence of God is drawn to humility. When you approach in reverence, knowing that He is able, His presence comes in fullness. That presence changes everything. It fills the room, fills your heart, fills your situation. In that presence, burdens lift without explanation. You begin to sense peace that surpasses understanding. You begin to hear answers in your spirit before they manifest in your world. That's the power of true prayer. It connects your heart to His mind and your will to His purpose. When prayer becomes your first response instead of your last resort, life begins to change. Many wait until the crisis comes before they pray, but those who live in continual communion with God walk in continual victory. Prayer is not only for the desperate moment, it is the daily breath of the believer. The one who lives in prayer walks in awareness of divine guidance. They see obstacles before they form and overcome them before they manifest. Prayer sharpens discernment and builds confidence. It keeps your spirit sensitive to the leading of the Holy Spirit. The more you pray, the less the enemy can deceive you, because prayer fills your inner man with light and truth. Every answered prayer begins with faith. Faith gives prayer its wings. Without faith, prayer is mere words, but with faith it becomes a weapon. The one who prays in faith does not focus on the mountain, they speak to it. They know that the authority given to them is greater than any obstacle before them. Prayer filled with faith carries the fragrance of victory. Heaven recognizes that sound. When you pray in faith, you are not knocking on a closed door. You are walking through one that has already been opened through grace. The veil was torn so that you could enter boldly into the throne of grace. You have access not as a stranger, but as a child. That awareness changes everything. It turns prayer from pleading into partnership, from fear into confidence, from worry into worship. Prayer is the spiritual connection that keeps the fire of faith alive. It is where revelation is born and strength is renewed. Every great move of God begins with prayer, and every revival is sustained by it. It is not optional, it is essential. The believer who neglects prayer lives beneath their potential, but the one who embraces it walks in divine rhythm with heaven. Prayer doesn't change God, it changes you. It molds your desires, strengthens your faith, and opens your eyes to the unseen. Through prayer, you become an instrument of His power and a vessel of His glory. In the quiet moments when your hands are lifted and your words rise in faith, all of heaven leans in to listen, and the presence of God begins to invade every impossible situation. Praise is the language of victory. When you praise in the midnight hour, the prison doors of limitation swing open. Praise is not a reaction to good times, it is a declaration of faith in hard times. It is the sound of trust that refuses to be silenced by circumstances. When you choose to praise in the darkness, you are making a bold statement that your faith is not dependent on what you see, but on who God is. Praise confuses the enemy because he expects fear, doubt, and despair. But when he hears praise rising from your lips, it signals that his power over you is broken. The spirit of heaviness cannot coexist with the spirit of praise. Where praise lives, freedom reigns. Where worship rises, chains fall. In the midnight hour, when everything seems still and silent, praise becomes a weapon. Midnight represents the darkest moment, the turning point between what was and what will be. It is in that darkness that faith must speak the loudest. Praise in that hour is not natural, it is supernatural. It flows from a heart that knows that God is faithful even when the answer has not yet appeared. It declares, "Even now I believe." When Paul and Silas praised God in the prison, their situation did not change first, their attitude did. They lifted a song in chains and heaven responded. The walls that confined them could not withstand the sound of faith-filled praise. The earth shook, the doors opened, and every chain was broken. That moment was not just about their freedom. It was a revelation that praise carries the power to shift any atmosphere. Praise lifts you out of the natural realm into the supernatural. It takes your eyes off the problem and places them on the one who has already overcome it. When you praise, you create an environment where the presence of God can dwell, and His presence is the atmosphere of miracles. Praise is not for when you feel strong. It is for when you feel weak and need to remind your soul of who your God is. It's for those moments when tears flow and answers seem delayed. It's the declaration that says, "My God is still good and He is still worthy." That kind of praise breaks the back of fear and releases power that cannot be contained. Every act of praise is an act of warfare. It pushes back against darkness, confusion, and oppression. Praise shifts the focus from the battle to the victory. When you lift your voice, you are releasing the sound of triumph even before the manifestation comes. You are telling your circumstances that they will not control your confession. The enemy's greatest weapon is silence. If he can quiet your praise, he can weaken your faith. But when you keep praising even with a whisper, you remind him that your strength is not in your situation but in your Savior. The sound of praise is a declaration that the battle has already been won. It's a victory song sung in the middle of the storm, knowing that peace is already on the way. When you praise in faith, you are not denying reality. You are declaring a higher reality. You are aligning your words with heaven's truth, not earth's facts. Praise doesn't ignore the pain, it invites healing. It doesn't deny the struggle, it declares dominion over it. When you begin to praise God in every situation, you are building a fortress of faith around your heart. That fortress protects your mind from fear, your emotions from anxiety, and your soul from despair. Praise is the sound that keeps your spirit alive in the midst of adversity. It's the melody that drives back darkness. When your lips open to glorify God, the atmosphere cannot remain the same. Praise attracts the presence of God, and where His presence is, there is liberty. In moments when words fail, praise speaks. There are seasons where you cannot find the right prayer, but you can still find a song. That song becomes your prayer. That melody becomes your strength. Praise has a language that reaches beyond logic. It's the cry of faith that says, I trust you, even here. Heaven understands that language. When you praise in pain, your worship becomes pure. It rises from the depths of your spirit and touches the heart of God. The angels join in harmony, the atmosphere fills with glory, and suddenly the weight that held you down begins to lift. The sound of praise breaks heaviness like sunlight breaks darkness. Praise also transforms your perspective. You may begin praising God for what He has done, but soon you find yourself praising Him for who He is. That's when transformation happens. When your praise moves from gratitude to adoration, from blessings to character, you step into a deeper revelation of His glory. You begin to realize that His presence is greater than any promise yet fulfilled. That awareness changes everything. The chains that once seemed unbreakable become insignificant when compared to His majesty. Your focus shifts from deliverance to devotion, from breakthrough to intimacy. And in that atmosphere of worship, breakthrough comes naturally. The secret of lasting victory is continual praise. Praise is not meant to be seasonal. It is meant to be a lifestyle. It is not confined to a service, a song, or a moment. It is the rhythm of a heart that knows it is already free. When praise becomes your default response, you stop being moved by circumstances and start moving circumstances through your faith. The enemy loses his power over a believer who refuses to stop praising. He cannot defeat a heart that rejoices in the Lord no matter the battle. Every time you choose praise over panic, joy over fear, worship over worry, you are shaking the foundation of the prison around you. Praise has a sound that the enemy cannot counterfeit. It is born in faith and sustained by trust. It carries the fragrance of heaven, and when it fills the atmosphere, darkness must flee. The prison doors of limitation, those invisible barriers that hold dreams, health, or peace, begin to swing open when genuine praise rises. Praise opens what effort cannot. It releases what striving cannot. It accomplishes what logic cannot explain. The presence of God moves through sound, and praise is that sound. When you lift it from a sincere heart, miracles happen naturally. Praise is not about the song itself. It's about the spirit behind it. You don't have to have perfect pitch. You just need pure faith. When the heart is right, even a whisper becomes thunder in the spirit realm. Praise is the language of those who know who they are in God. It is the anthem of the redeemed. It is the response of those who have seen His hand in the past and trust His heart for the future. So when you find yourself in the midnight hour, lift your voice. When everything around you seems locked and dark, lift your hands. When your emotions tell you to quit, let your spirit sing. Because the moment you choose praise, heaven begins to move, and the prison doors of limitation swing open wide. The glory of God fills the atmosphere where faith-filled voices rise in worship, turning captivity into freedom and despair into dancing. The glory is not a distant mist or a passing feeling. It is the manifested presence of God Himself. It is the weight of His reality pressing into human experience, the divine atmosphere that transforms everything it touches. When believers lift their voices in true worship, something begins to shift in the unseen realm. The ordinary becomes extraordinary. The natural yields to the supernatural. The presence of God begins to saturate the space, and where His glory resides, nothing oppressive can remain. The chains that once felt unbreakable begin to melt away, because no bondage can exist in the radiance of His presence. Worship is the key that unlocks that glory. It is not the sound of the instruments or the melody of the song. It is the posture of the heart. When faith rises through worship, the glory descends in response. There is something powerful that happens when worship is born from faith and not from feeling. Many worship only when life feels good, but true worship comes alive in the storm. It is when the tears fall and the heart trembles that worship becomes its purest. It is in those moments that faith is tested and proven. When a believer chooses to worship through pain, it becomes an offering that heaven cannot ignore. That sound reaches higher than the noise of fear, higher than the voice of doubt. It pierces through the darkness and touches the throne of God. In response, the glory descends like fire, consuming everything that is not of Him. The heaviness that once weighed you down begins to lift, not because the situation changed, but because the atmosphere did. The moment the glory enters, freedom follows. The glory of God carries the fragrance of liberty. It cannot coexist with despair or defeat. In the Old Testament, when the priests worshipped in one accord, the glory filled the temple so strongly that they could not stand to minister. That same glory is not confined to a building. It fills the hearts of those who believe. When you begin to worship with faith, your heart becomes a living temple and the glory fills it. The peace of God begins to overflow and His presence becomes tangible. Fear loses its grip, anxiety is silenced, and confusion fades. You begin to sense that the King has entered the room. His glory always brings change. Chains are broken, sickness is healed, and joy replaces mourning. Where His glory dwells, victory is not a promise, it is a reality. Worship is more than a song. It is a spiritual surrender. It's where you lay down your worries, your pride, your striving, and make room for Him to move. When faith-filled voices unite in worship, they create an altar in the Spirit. On that altar, the fire of His glory falls. It consumes the sacrifice of praise and fills the atmosphere with divine presence. The glory does not just visit, it abides. It lingers over hearts that are yielded, over places where faith is alive. When you truly worship, you don't have to beg for breakthrough. The glory brings it. Captivity cannot survive in the glory. Every form of bondage, whether mental, emotional, or spiritual, begins to unravel under its power. The glory is the environment of freedom because it reveals the truth of who God is and who you are in Him. When despair turns into dancing, it is not because the pain was ignored. It is because the presence of God redefined it. The glory transforms sorrow into celebration. It turns ashes into beauty, mourning into joy, heaviness into praise. It does not deny reality, it overwhelms it. In the glory, what was broken becomes whole, what was lost is restored, and what was dead comes alive again. There is no effort required to make it happen. It is the natural result of being in His presence. Worship draws that presence, faith sustains it. When you lift your heart in faith-filled worship, you are creating a dwelling place for the glory. It is not a visitation, it is habitation. You become a carrier of His presence, and wherever you go, the atmosphere must change. Faith-filled worship is the secret to living under the continual flow of glory. It is not about volume or performance. It is about purity. It is the sound of trust, the song of surrender, the melody of gratitude. When worship is real, heaven responds. The angels join in, the atmosphere trembles, and miracles begin to unfold. The presence of God fills the space so completely that human limitations disappear. You begin to move from striving to resting, from worrying to trusting. The glory of God does not come to entertain, it comes to transform. When it fills the atmosphere, every dark thing is exposed and expelled. That is why worship is warfare. It is not just a moment of expression, it is an invasion of divine power. The glory of God is not limited to a sanctuary, it fills every place where faith is alive. It can fill a home, a hospital room, a workplace, or a quiet corner where a heart cries out in worship. It is drawn to faith the way fire is drawn to fuel. Wherever faith burns, the glory falls. You may start in tears, but the glory turns those tears into joy. You may start in weakness, but the glory renews your strength. You may start in silence, but the glory releases a song. When faith and worship combine, heaven becomes visible on earth. The presence of God becomes more real than the problem before you. You stop reacting to circumstances and start responding to His Spirit. When worship is pure and faith is strong, the atmosphere becomes pregnant with miracles. The glory creates an environment where the impossible becomes inevitable. You don't have to strive or force it, you simply yield to it. The more you focus on Him, the more His presence manifests. The weight of His glory brings order to chaos, light to darkness, peace to turmoil. You may not see how it happens, but you will know when it does because everything begins to shift. The burden lifts, the chains fall, the atmosphere fills with life. It is not emotional energy, it is divine reality. The glory of God is both gentle and powerful. It comforts and conquers at the same time. It heals the wounded heart while overthrowing the works of the enemy. It restores the broken while empowering the believer. When faith-filled worship rises, heaven touches earth, the unseen becomes seen, and the miraculous becomes normal. The same Spirit that filled the temple now fills the hearts of those who believe. The same presence that once hovered over the mercy seat now dwells within every worshiper. When you open your heart in faith and lift your voice in worship, the glory begins to fill the atmosphere, turning captivity into freedom and despair into dancing. Every time you choose to pray instead of panic and praise instead of complain, you release heavenly power that shakes the foundations of bondage. In that moment of decision when fear whispers and worry presses, you have a choice: to yield to anxiety or to turn your heart toward faith. Prayer and praise are not the reactions of the weak. They are the weapons of the strong. When life presses hard against you, your natural instinct may be to panic, but the spiritual instinct of faith is to pray. Panic magnifies the problem, but prayer magnifies God. Complaint focuses on the pain, but praise focuses on the promise. When you choose faith over fear and worship over worry, you position yourself for breakthrough. Heaven begins to move not because the problem is big, but because your faith has been activated. Prayer replaces panic because it draws your attention away from what you cannot control and fixes it on the one who reigns over all things. It brings peace in the middle of pressure. The moment you pray, the atmosphere starts to shift. The situation may not change instantly, but something within you does. Panic drains strength, prayer restores it. Panic confuses the mind, prayer brings clarity. Panic invites chaos, prayer invites peace. When you pray, you are declaring that your trust is in God's power, not your own understanding. You are saying, I may not have the answer, but I know the one who does. That confession releases divine strength. The Spirit of God begins to stir within you, replacing fear with faith, weakness with boldness, and confusion with direction. When you choose praise over complaint, you silence the voice of defeat. Complaining fuels darkness, but praise releases light. The more you complain, the heavier your spirit becomes, but the more you praise, the lighter you feel. Praise lifts your focus from the weight of your circumstances to the greatness of your God. It turns the atmosphere of heaviness into one of hope. The enemy knows that if he can make you complain, he can weaken your faith, but if you choose to praise, his grip is broken. Praise is not denial of pain, it is defiance of despair. It says, I will not give in to fear because my God is greater. Every time you praise in adversity, you are shaking the foundation of the enemy's plan. What he meant for evil begins to lose power in the presence of your worship. Faith is revealed in your choices during pressure. Anyone can praise when life feels good, but real power is released when you praise in the storm. That is when your worship becomes a weapon. Every song of praise in a difficult season carries the sound of victory. It confuses the enemy because he expects silence, but instead he hears strength. He expects defeat, but instead he hears determination. The sound of praise is the sound of unshakable faith. It tells every power of darkness that you will not bow to fear. When prayer and praise unite in the heart of a believer, they release a force that cannot be contained. Heaven responds to that kind of faith. There is always a moment before every miracle where you must decide to trust. Panic tries to convince you that things will never change. Complaint tries to convince you that God has forgotten. But faith rises to say, even now God is working. Prayer fuels that faith and praise expresses it. Together they create movement in the spirit realm. You may not see it immediately, but the ground beneath your feet begins to tremble. The same power that opened prison doors for Paul and Silas begins to move through your situation. The chains of fear, lack, and limitation cannot withstand the vibration of faith. The more you pray, the stronger you become. The more you praise, the freer you feel. When you pray instead of panic, you step out of the natural into the supernatural. You give God permission to intervene. Heaven never ignores a cry of faith. The angels move at the sound of your voice when that voice carries the authority of belief. When you praise instead of complain, you are declaring your victory before it manifests. You are telling your circumstances that you will not be moved by what you see, but by what you know. The spiritual realm begins to align with your declaration. The words of faith from your mouth create a pathway for God's power to flow. Every time you choose to lift your hands in praise, it's like lighting a fire in the dark. That fire spreads until every shadow flees. Panic and praise cannot occupy the same heart. One must give way to the other. When praise enters, panic has to leave. When faith rises, fear loses its hold. That is why the choice is so powerful. It determines the atmosphere of your life. Every time you choose prayer, you invite peace. Every time you choose praise, you release power. These two actions are simple but supernatural. They are not dependent on how you feel but on what you believe. Prayer says, God is able, and praise says, God has done it. Prayer reaches up, praise draws down. Together they create a complete cycle of faith that keeps heaven's power flowing into your situation. Prayer aligns you with God's will, and praise aligns your atmosphere with His glory. When you stop complaining and start praising, you are declaring that the situation will not dictate your spirit. You are establishing the rule of heaven over the chaos of earth. Complaints invite more problems, but praise invites solutions. Worry invites stress, but prayer invites peace. Each time you lift your heart in prayer, it's like turning on a light in a dark room. Each time you open your mouth in praise, it's like unlocking a prison door. The walls around you may be strong, but they cannot stand against the sound of faith. Heaven moves in response to choices of faith. It's not the loudness of your prayer that moves God, it's the sincerity. It's not the perfection of your praise, it's the purity. When He sees that you trust Him enough to pray instead of panic, He releases grace. When He sees that you praise in pain, He releases power. Your situation might not make sense, but your worship doesn't depend on sense. It depends on spirit. The foundation of bondage cannot hold when the sound of prayer and praise fills the air. The enemy's strategies crumble, and new doors begin to open. You may not feel it at first, but in the unseen realm there is movement. Heaven is responding, chains are loosening, and miracles are forming. Every moment you choose prayer over panic, you build endurance. Every time you choose praise over complaint, you build strength. These are not small choices, they are spiritual victories. They determine whether your heart remains heavy or becomes free. They determine whether you walk in peace or in pressure. The believer who learns this secret walks in continual power. The storms may come, but they no longer control you. Because when others panic, you pray. When others complain, you praise. And in that posture of faith, heaven responds, the atmosphere shifts, and the foundations of bondage begin to shake under the power of divine presence.